Hello, everyone, and welcome to Real Story Group's latest webinar. I'm Tony Byrne, the founder of Real Story Group, and I'll be your host today and presenter. I really love this topic. I'm excited to be here with you today because it really brings together three concepts of great interest to me. One is myth busting, which you know we've been doing for 20 years. The other is these kind of bullshit three-letter acronyms that analyst firms make up, like DXP, which we also have opinions about. And then maybe a little bit more, hopefully, what is the role of WCM in the future of your MarTech or CX stack? And so we're going to do some myth busting, but then we're going to kind of finish on a more positive note. So many of you today I know are new to Real Story Group. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the company, but more importantly, let you know that you'll receive a copy of the slides within about 24 hours of this session. Those of you whose firms subscribe to our research or participate in our council will get access to the full recording as well, which you can share with your colleagues. So without further ado, let's get into it. Oh, also wanted to remind you, you can use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel to ask any questions at all during this half-hour session. If there's something you agree with, something you disagree with, something that's not clear, or just any kind of query or input that you want to put in, we'll definitely have time to turn to that. Okay. A little bit of background about Real Story Group. I founded the firm 20 years ago because of this quadrant you see on the left. I was working at a systems integration firm. We were implementing web content and digital experience technologies, and we're very frustrated with the kind of traditional analyst research that was out there. We thought that their findings as external analysts were very different from our findings as people who were actually implementing the technology. And then when I found out about all the conflicts of interest in the analyst world, I thought, well, there has to be a better way to tell the real story. So I founded CMS Watch, now Real Story Group. And we're different from, I believe, almost every analyst firm in the world, in as much as we never advise or consult to vendors. We never participate in any of their boondoggles. They can't quote us in their press releases and everything else. What that means is that we're completely on your side of the table. We only work for enterprise buyers, and that makes our research and analysis, I would say, a little bit harder hitting than you'll find from other analyst firms. Okay, now let's get into the meat of the topic today. What is the DXP? What is a DXP, and what's so mythological about it, and why does that matter? So let's start out with 6 myths that you'll hear out there from analyst firms, from vendors themselves, sometimes from consultants. So the first is that websites remain the center of your digital ecosystem. Now, websites and web content management are very important, table stakes in this world, but the reality is that your customers are increasingly interacting with you, your customers and your prospects, through a variety of different channels, and not just your website. And particularly once they become a customer, very often they may never go back to your website again. You may just interact with them through email, messaging, interactive applications, so on and so forth. So what has happened is not that websites have become unimportant, it's just that they're not necessarily the center of your digital ecosystem anymore. And so that has profound implications for some of the technology choices that you're making. And then similarly, this idea, which is really embedded in this whole DXP concept, is that you should center your stack on a web content management system. That may have been true 10 years ago. I think what we're seeing is that the center of your stack has actually shifted dramatically, and I'll talk about that. The other assumption that's underneath this notion of a digital experience platform is that inbound and outbound are kind of two different worlds. That DXP is really focused very much on inbound, and outbound communications and marketing is just kind of like this extraneous thing that they sort of do with some poor tooling. And really, you actually need to balance those two worlds and integrate them very, very carefully. And the whole DXP concept never really had an answer there. The other myth is that somehow portal technology remains broadly relevant. Now, portal technology has some uses in certain narrow use cases. We think particularly like customer extranets or distributor dealer extranets, that sort of thing. But the reality is that portal technology as a niche has largely failed in the market. And the whole origin of DXPs were actually portal vendors, specifically IBM and LifeRay going to analyst firms and saying, hey, we need a new word for portal because nobody will use that word anymore. And so they fought together and said, let's just call it a digital experience platform. And then, of course, web content management vendors clued in too. And so this was basically a way of putting old wine in new bottles. That then propagated the myth that you can actually buy a DXP. The reality is that digital experience platforms, as defined by analyst firms, actually don't exist. And when you pin down an analyst firm, as some of them have been in the media, what is a DXP? And they say, well, it's really more of a concept or a way of life. There isn't anything. There's no such thing as a digital experience platform that you can buy. It's the whole notion of DXPs is that they're sort of these cobbled together tools that do different things, and you'll see that in a minute. And the other lifeline that vendors are coming up with here is this notion, well, maybe DXPs don't exist, but maybe a composable DXP, a DXP composed of different parts, maybe that exists, and maybe this is actually the future. And I'm going to argue actually that it isn't the future. So we already got a quick question here from Aaron around clarify inbound and outbound. Yeah. So inbound is basically people coming to a digital property. So it's typically coming to your website, to an application, to a call center, and sort of they're coming to you, to your digital property. Outbound is more you reaching out to them through email, messaging, automated voice, so on and so forth. And historically, these have been, and still today, can be very different sets of technologies, very different tool sets. And within many organizations, unfortunately, Aaron, often very different sets of people, whereas one might be marketing and the other is digital experience. The reality is those two, in a coherent customer journey, those two need to be in sync and working very closely together. Okay, so these are the myths. Let's talk about where we are today, and then we'll do a little bit of history. So today, when we look at the Web CMS marketplace, the best way we believe to look at it as in any mature marketplace is on a complexity spectrum. We have the most complex tools on the left and the simpler products on the right. This is a spectrum. There's no right or wrong here, except I'll notice that the legacy vendors, who we call sometimes the dinosaur vendors, have largely failed in the marketplace. We've seen persistent success in what we describe as the upper range and mid-range boxes here. These vendors have tended to continue to be successful, many of them evolving. I think there are a lot of questions that have emerged around toolkits, particularly Adobe and Sitecore, Tridian largely disappearing from the market. Questions around whether they're actually too heavy for this more flexible, agile era that we're in. There is a consensus emerging on hybrid headless as an architecture. In other words, that you can be headless and head full, and that there's different use cases within the same enterprise. But the key theme here, really, for the early 2020s is customers really wanting to get lighter and simpler here. That they're seeing, again, not that websites or web content management is unimportant, but that relative to all of their other kind of CX and MarTech initiatives, it's really just one channel. And it may not, in certain journeys, may not always be the most important channel for what you're trying to do in these sorts of blended journeys. So really what you want to do is be lighter and simpler and not overinvest in excessively heavyweight platforms that can slow you down. I think that's really the big theme for the last several years. It's a very different theme from where we were in the 2010s, where really the goal was multi-channel modernization. So the idea is you had these major channels, and then underneath them you had production, interaction, delivery services in gray. And then you had these major content and engagement management silos that were built up over time. And then underneath that was, integrating with various enterprise data stores and that sort of thing. And so we spent a lot of time modernizing and getting really good at some of these things. I know some of you are still on this journey in these particular silos. And the problem was, though, that we ended up building these massive silos that are largely freestanding and don't talk to each other very effectively. And the lateral integration has become a huge challenge for many enterprises. And it's really in the way of effective customer engagement. And the pandemic really called this out, when I know a lot of our council members were telling us customers are showing up in all kinds of places we didn't expect them, and we weren't ready for them. And, here we were personalizing through the web channel, and they were interacting with us more by email or SMS and so forth. And at the time, when we were using this model, particularly in the early 2010s and counseling large enterprises, we would say, well, what's your center of gravity? And by that, we meant, which of these 4 boxes is really kind of the center, and you build everything else around it. And for a lot of people, their answer was, well, my web content and digital asset management, that's my center of gravity. I'm going to build everything around that. Right? I'm going to build my e-commerce around that, my email marketing, my social around that. And it turns out that that model may have worked for the 2010s, but it doesn't really work for the 2020s, because it turns out the real center of gravity is actually beneath this purple bar this magenta bar at the bottom. The center of gravity is actually starting to become much lower in your stack. So some of you may have seen this before. It's a reference architecture framework we have for the 2020s where you want to build an omni-channel stack. Now, this one specifically is for a B2C vendor. For a B2B vendor, a B2C enterprise. For a large B2B enterprise, it might be a little bit different. But the idea here is, of course, you still have these engagement channels. If anything, there's more of them at the top. You have various interaction and delivery environments. And then you still have content and engagement management services, except now web content management has really become kind of one of 6 when you look at all the different ways that you might be engaging. And so it's not that it's become unimportant, but its relative importance in your broader customer experience strategy it has narrowed a bit. Now, ideally, you'll decouple content engagement management services from interaction services, so that's headless, and so that's useful. But what we're talking a lot about now with large enterprises that we're advising is what we describe as legless. That is, you decouple these enterprise foundation services from your content and engagement services, and that allows you to be very flexible at the edge and to also really start getting towards this nirvana of a coherent 360 customer experience across channels. So you centralize some of your core product and component content in an omni-channel content platform along with your product information management. You have core customer data, unified customer data that you can activate and manage. And then we see decisioning and personalization also moving lower in the stack so that you can have personalization that's not bound to a specific channel, but personalization and decisioning that allows you to work across channels. No one has quite gotten here yet, but we're working with many large enterprises who are using this as a reference model in terms of a 2B architecture going forward. And so, what does this mean? And we have seen this already happening in the late 2010s as far as web content and experience management, is that beginning to see sort of savvy buyers trying to right-size their WCM investments relative to other needs. And with more attention to marketing attribution and closer scrutiny of costs, it's sort of saying, okay, well, if we invest we're maybe spending millions of dollars a year on our website. Is this really where we need to be putting our funds? It's not that we want to underinvest in our website, but there may be other channels, different applications, different areas where we're going to be more effectively engaging with customers. And then along the way, it turns out that with great innovation in the mid-market of the web content management environment, most of the mid-market packages can do 80% or more of what the upper tier vendors can do. So, combine that with this notion of what we've been talking about, this Pilates, just building up more of your core. I think what this has already driven, and is going to really continue, is getting thinner at engagement tiers. And so what we've been seeing is a lot of questioning of, you have these massive complex platforms, as you see at the top. Maybe if I don't need this platform to be a decision maker and it's more of an order taker, do I really need something that complex? And we're starting to see a lot of interesting kind of reconsideration of investments at this level. And so what is a web content management vendor to do, like Sitecore, Acquia? Adobe is, of course, a bit more, but certainly Adobe AEM is a foundational piece of its broader stack. And so, what that coincided then with this notion of vendors working with analyst firms to come up with this new acronym called Digital Experience Platform. So we're not a web content management vendor anymore, we're a digital experience platform. And if I combine all these things like e-commerce and digital asset management and outbound marketing and web content management and throw all these things together, I'm going to call it a digital experience platform. Now, mind you, these were not platforms you could buy. But this was what vendors wanted to say. And basically, they were WCM and portal vendors saying that you should center your stack around their solutions and then build out e-commerce and other things around it. This turned out to be really doubling down on the 2010s. Rather than taking a more forward-looking, truly omni-channel approach to this, it got away from some of the dinosaurs in this industry. I'll pick a little bit on Sitecore here, although I think they've made some steps in the right direction. Sitecore was really kind of a great example of this, where they built this massive XP platform that you see on the left that included massive search infrastructure, a marketing engine, a quasi-CDP, a number of other things in the platform. It was tremendously complex. They eventually acquired the bones of Microsoft Commerce Server in 2014, and then they acquired a notable DAM vendor, Style Labs, in 2018. And so you have, on the one hand, building this tremendous monolithic WCM platform, on the other hand, beginning to acquire some other technologies around it. And what this meant really was a kind of a dead end for them. And there's a link here to a very interesting YouTube that you might want to watch, YouTube video, that Sitecore basically says, look, it was a kind of an honest self-critique that their own platform was too big, too monolithic. The customers wanted to choose products from multiple vendors, that they wanted more lighter weight front ends, that mammoth single-tenant platforms are causing issues, and that hybrid headless architectures are the future. I couldn't agree more, except that this was a complete about-face for Sitecore. I give them kudos for being courageous enough to actually do this and make essentially a 180-degree turn. Their take on this, you can see, is what they call a composable DXP. So by composable DXP, what they mean is, we're going to get some other solutions that you can optionally add on top and blend in, rather than everything living in the XP platform. And so they acquired a lightweight CDP, a personalization vendor, BoxEver, a kind of a niche e-commerce play in 451, and then Moosend, a very lightweight marketing automation platform. So it's a kind of a mix and match sort of strategy here. They're working on refactoring their core WCM platform to become a little bit more modernized. They say it exists already, not quite true. But this notion of what they call this here is a composable DXP. So it's really, really interesting to watch analyst firms pick this up as well and say, well, when we talk about digital experience platforms, I guess we were wrong after all. Instead, what you need is a composable digital experience stack. And I don't disagree about the composability. I think the question is, I disagree about why do I need to do this through my web content management vendor. And so let's talk about that in a minute. And I see some questions have come up, and I'll invite you if you want to ask more questions as well. Aaron is asking, will the slides be shared? Yes. And we will definitely be sharing the slides with everyone. And if you are a Real Story Group subscriber, you'll get access to the recorded video as well. If not WCM, what is the center of gravity for the stack? So that's what Guy is asking. Guy, I'm going to get to that. That's a great question. If WCM isn't the center of gravity, or if my marketing automation platform isn't the center of gravity, or even if my e-commerce platform is not the center of gravity, then what is? And I've got a very straightforward answer for that. And it really revolves around this alternative to a composable DXP. So Guy, I'm going to get to this actually in the next slide. So first is, why would you want your web content management vendor to compose your stack? So this is a very interesting question that I think gets unasked amid traditional analyst firms and the vendors themselves. When you look at what Episerver and Acquia and certainly Sitecore and certainly Adobe and even especially Salesforce have done, is that the suites that they put together that they might have called a composable digital experience platform are actually a motley collection of different tools. They often have very different vertical or industry orientations, which is important to know. They almost always have different sort of marketplace orientation. So by that I mean B2B versus B2C. So some of the tools in, say, Acquia Stack might be more B2B oriented, others more B2C. That matters. Different customer target sizes. We've seen this with Salesforce in particular, where they may have some low-end solutions that they're trying to glom onto some higher-end solutions and vice versa. Almost always different cloud architecture, SaaS versus PaaS, and very different development paradigms. So these composable stacks that they're trying to put together are a motley collection. It would be a total accident if they were all happen to be best fit for you. So what the vendors come back and say, well, if you buy everything from us, it'll be integrated. But if they're truly composable, that really shouldn't matter, right? Like I should be able, if the whole point of composability is to plug and play. And if they're API first or API forward, again, this integration issue shouldn't really be an issue. And I think they're really wanting to have it both ways, to say you get a better experience if you buy it all from us, but oh, by the way, it's just as good as if you plug in other vendors' capabilities. And so if the idea is that I can plug in other vendors, then why should I compose a digital experience stack? Maybe what I should do is compose a more omni-channel stack for the future that looks at more than just web content management. And so the idea is really to compose your own omni-channel stack that's more than just digital experience, but looks at the broader issues of customer experience. And so the benefits of this are you get more of a 360 customer orientation as opposed to just their experience when they're visiting your website or your mobile application. You get better alignment between inbound and outbound experiences. You can pick different tools that are best fit for your business as opposed to tools that a vendor just happen to collect and aggregate themselves. One of the big wins we've seen when we've been advising large vendors is architectural coherence. And that architectural coherence then sets you up for flexibility and adaptability going forward as your business needs change. And in particular, the ability to plug different tools in. And so, for example, if you're going to get a new chatbot or digital concierge service, you can leverage some of the content and decisioning services that you have already invested in. And fundamentally, I think this is also about being able to take advantage of more modern tools. And I think if we look at the web content management and experience marketplace, many of these vendors have been around for 20, 25 years. There's significant technical debt. There's also, I would say, almost some architectural debt, even among some newer vendors like Contentful. Their vision of what digital experience is and can be tends to be very, very narrow. And I think too narrow. For the level of investment that they want you to make in their platform. And so I think the benefits here of not relying on an older or more, I would say, blindered web content management vendor to drive your stack, you want to instead own the stack yourself. And so to answer your question, Guy, what's really the center of gravity is everything. I know this is covered up by the benefits box here, but what's really driving this is the this enterprise foundation services that you see here, that's the new center of gravity in your stack. And by extension, that's really where you ought to be investing going forward. We've got a number of other recorded webinars on that and articles about that on our site. We've been talking about this notion of Pilates, that is really building out your core for the 2020s, that's the main kind of architectural task for a kind of forward-looking MarTech stack. Okay. Hopefully we are still sharing the screen here. I see we may have lost. Let me just double check that we are good here. Okay. Douglas, hopefully you can see us. Great. So wanted to just reiterate that my point earlier is, the enterprise foundation services, that's really where the center of gravity is going to be going forward. And that doesn't mean that e-commerce and web content management and loyalty and CRM are unimportant. It's just that those are likely to be simpler tooling, and a lot of the complexity is going to be shielded from those systems and absorbed more at an enterprise level so that you can have a more omni-channel orientation. Okay. So the first thing I'll see today is drop the word DXP. This was something that vendors and analysts cooked up that has really no relevance in the 2020s. Where you want to be thinking is modernizing your broader stack with Pilates investments at the core. Starting, I would say, certainly with customer data, but also looking at omnichannel content and omnichannel decisioning and personalization. This is an opportunity to simplify the engagement layer, not just for web content management, but also for things like loyalty and CRM, and potentially simplifying your email marketing and outbound marketing as well. We're working with a number of enterprises now who are backing these platforms with CDPs, and it gives them a lot more choices than they had before. The hard truth is that the traditional WCM vendors who have now renamed themselves DXP vendors, they're likely not going to be good allies in this transition because they are trying to hold on to older architectures that put a lot of logic and data too forward from the enterprise and too stuck in a single channel. And to that extent, you really want to beware of any vendors who are trying to compose your stack for you. You want to own your enterprise architectural decision making. Now, it may be that you still work with a vendor like Oculus, Salesforce, Adobe, Oracle, Microsoft, but you're going to do it because you're going to pick a particular tool in their suite that's the right fit for you and that it can plug into the rest of your architecture. You just need to be careful that many of these vendors don't want to plug into your architecture. They want to own your architecture. You want to own it yourself. So you want to prepare to be flexible at engagement tiers. So what this means is really setting yourself up so that you can, regardless of whatever your front end is, you already have your personalization rules set behind it, your customer data available behind it, and so that allows you to be flexible about what you can plug in. So digital experience is important. So, I don't want to lose the DX and the DXP part here, but we think that thinking about customer experience more holistically is more potent, and hopefully the pandemic taught us all that we were already headed in that direction, I think, in the late 2000s, but the pandemic showed us that customers are showing up in all kinds of unexpected places. They're not always going to behave the way we want. The funnel, whatever it was, is not a linear funnel anymore. You really need to integrate offline and online, and so this notion of investing just in this inbound digital experience as its own silo is really thinking too narrowly. The good news is, and you've heard me kind of criticizing some of the received conventional wisdom here. I want to end on kind of a higher note, which is that there's some good news here, that some of your colleagues are doing this successfully. We're working with some enterprises who really are thinking forward here and are working very hard to make this transition, and they're beginning to see some benefits. And as they look at, the next wave of what they're going to do at the engagement layer, being able to adapt more modern, more flexible, often lower cost, lower complexity tooling, because they've absorbed a lot of that complexity in some of their enterprise systems. So happy to work with you to help you personally and your enterprise guide you through this new era. That's what most of our work these days. There's 3 ways that Real Story Group can help you. First is we do vendor evaluations. This is what we've done for 20 years across all of these different streams here represented on this subway map. So you can just license an individual stream like customer data platforms or marketing automation and email service providers. And we give you the inside scoop on not just the strengths of these vendors, but what are their real weaknesses of both the vendor and the platform. And got different dynamic ways where you can build custom quadrants as opposed to static quadrants that really respond to what's important to you. The second option is you can license all of our research and get a full stack subscription, and then we can advise you on your larger stack choices. And then a subset of those large enterprises then join our council, which meets every other month. We share best practices. It's a confidential group of large enterprise MarTech leaders who share lessons learned and advice with each other to make each other stronger and to help each other out in a truly cooperative way. So if you're interested in any of those, feel free to contact us at any of these coordinates. You can also download a free sample of our research. That's my colleague, Scott. He's on PTO today, but if you reach out to us, you're likely going to hear his friendly voice on the phone. And most of all, what he wants to do is listen to you, to listen to what are the issues, what are the opportunities that are in front of you, and how can we make you more successful. So with that, we definitely have time for more questions or comments. And so I'm just looking through this. Lisa, thank you and Douglas for your input. James, great to hear from you. If anyone else has any final kind of questions, happy to entertain them here before we cut out. So I see Aaron saying, I struggle with the concept of WCM being co-equal. All the other platforms either provide additional functionality to it or drive users to it. So I think, you know, a lot of this depends on your strategy and what is the purpose of your website. For some organizations, their website is their product. That's certainly our case. Our website is also delivering information, but we're in the information business. If I'm a manufacturing or a consumer products good company, I'm not sure that my website is necessarily, I should maybe manage it like a product, but it's not necessarily how all my customers are engaging with me, at least not full time. Because I have a more complex array of touch points, and my website really should drive them to do something else. And so whether to drive them to an e-commerce platform or to sign up for some research or a webinar so that I can kind of engage with them in a more interactive way. So is my website important? Yes. Is it the center of my MarTech stack? Maybe not. I would argue it's not the center of gravity, certainly, which is much lower, and that it's really more of a co-equal partner in what is a multiplying set of digital engagement touch points. And your web content management vendor can't manage all those touch points for you. So you should narrow your expectations of what you're going to get from a WCM vendor. The vendors themselves, quite understandably, don't want to be a narrow niche part of your stack. They want to be the center of your stack. I'm just arguing, Aaron, that's not in your best interest necessarily. Great. So let's see. Jason is asking, do your vendor evaluations currently take into account how composable or API first various offerings are and which ones? So the short answer is yes, we do. The longer answer, Jason, is that a lot of the devils are in the details here. So we've seen some platforms that nominally are composable and API forward, and then they have some really interesting dependencies sometimes that make them not maybe as flexible as you might wish. So, you know, we tend to sort of caveat these sorts of things. Douglas is asking, it takes a lot of internal maturity for a company to adopt this model. I think companies should do this. Do these companies not staff up internally? Or do you see progress amongst your clients or hiring advice? So Douglas, that's a great point. I think where we see that a lot of the energy come from this is companies that have mature enterprise architecture functions, is that this is really the job of enterprise architecture to help create a coherent stack strategy here in close cooperation, you know, with your MarTech colleagues. And in particular, when we see EAs, enterprise architects who are tied to MarTech, this makes a lot of sense to them when they're dedicated to MarTech or CX functions. And more broadly, I think we're seeing MarTech leaders, the really forward-looking ones, sort of seeing that what happens just within their narrow domain isn't the full scope of what they need to be focusing on. That there's a larger CX picture here, that inbound and outbound and then everything else from loyalty to chatbots, everything else really matters. And so the more forward-thinking MarTech leaders are beginning to take this omnichannel approach. And honestly, I believe that if they don't, no one else will. But you're right that it requires a certain maturity. The two areas where we think that organizations who tend to be most successful at this do two things. One is they invest a lot in enterprise architecture, and secondly, they invest a lot in marketing operations. Marketing operations thinks about this sort of stuff really hard too. And so those two companies with mature functions in those areas are often, you know, a couple of years ahead or more of their peers and sort of moving to this new architecture. Great. So hey, folks, it's been wonderful spending time with you this afternoon. We've run a little bit late, but feel free to reach out if you have any further questions. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Bye now.